So Aviva Zornberg, in her chapter on this parsha, sees the entire chapter, and especially the search for and selection of Rivka, as responsive to what she calls the tragic residue of the Akedah, of the binding of Isaac. There is a long, long, extensive midrashic tradition that Sarah dies as a result of the Akedah, from the shock of it. And I do want to just note, in speaking of the Akedah, that for some people, the narrative of a parent's willingness to slaughter their own child is actually true to their own experience, right? Some of us read this narrative with memories of abuse, at physical and emotional, at the hand of a parent. It is a shocking narrative, but it is less alien to human experience, I think, than we would like it to be. Now, of course, part of the traumatic shock of the Akedah as a narrative, and in the way that it echoes in real life situations, is that it presents so squarely the horror of the intertwining of theology and of human violence and evil, right? The Akedah asks us to sit with the question of, did God really ask this? Or did Abraham have it wrong? That question is never answered. Is it ever possible that to do, quote, the right thing, to obey God's will, requires us to do what seems to us to be so evil? Right? That is a kind of abyss that the text opens for us, makes us look at, and never resolve. And this is part of the trauma that the tragic aftermath of the Akedah that Zornberg is pointing to which our parsha comes as a response. I do want to say that as we talk about this question of, is it ever possible to do the right thing, we've studied at various times midrashim from the collection Dirshuni, and there is a midrash by Rivka Lubitch who reads that the test to Abraham, which is listed as achar hadvarim ha'ele, after these things, means after the test to Sarah. And before going to Abraham, God comes to Sarah and says, take your son, your only one whom you have loved, Isaac, and take him up to the land of Moriah and offer him up. The Sarah amra lo. And Sarah said, no, because a mother does not slaughter her child. And the Midrash absolutely reads that Sarah passed the test and Abraham failed. And when Sarah awakens the next morning, she is shocked to discover that the youth and Abraham, his father, Enenu, were not there. And she cries out to God, saying, I know that one who slaughters his son in the name of God will in the end be left without a son or God. Forgive Abraham, who is mistaken about this. Please remember that it did not occur to a mother to offer her son up to God. And you, God, remembering that, save the boy from him. It's a radical reworking of the way that the rabbinic tradition and the liturgical tradition on the High Holy Days has understood the impact of the Akedah, saying that the merit that we are supposed to remember is not Abraham who did this, but Sarah who refused, right? And that God saves Isaac and Abraham because of Sarah's merit, and says, now I know, to Abraham, that you fear God, even though you did not withhold your son. Not because you did not, but even though you should have, right? I think it's important it's a very gorgeous, powerful midrash. Okay, but this is the abyss that we are sitting in. And so Zornberg describes what we might call a trauma response. And I'm using this not in a technical um, therapeutic psychological term, but in just in the sense of an experience that we may have of trauma, which I think she is conceiving as primarily relating to a disintegration of meaning, right? Of an inability to reconstruct a life after experiencing in such an intimate firsthand way the radical contingency of being. She pulls from the Midrash the phrase kimat shelo, the experience of almost not, of almost non-existence, right? And what I describe as the abyss of the question of human evil being intertwined with theology and the inability to make sense of the presence of evil in the world, a father who could do this, and it seeming be at the behest of God. That response, the disintegration of meaning, manifests also in the utter breakdown in relationships, right? Sarah dies as a result. She is unable to bear the weight of this. God never speaks to Abraham again. Abraham never speaks to God again, that we know. Abraham and Isaac never speak to each other again. And ultimately, Isaac, together with Ishmael, buries their father. They bury their father together without Isaac having received his father's blessing. Right? God has to do that, sees to that after Abraham dies. Now, what Zornberg brings here is the sense in which the fundamental problem, and therefore the fundamental solution, is a question of chesed, of loving kindness. I mentioned that chesed is one of the light words of this parsha. Rebecca is so associated with chesed. This is, by the way, not the only time in the Torah that we see chesed in response to traumatic loss. We have it also in the book of Ruth, right? Ruth is associated with chesed toward Naomi, her mother-in-law, after the shocking, horrific death of her husband and two sons. So Zornberg says here, she asks the big theological question, right? What can it have meant to Abraham to undergo the test and then simply, silently, to have Isaac restored to him? Right? The insufficiency of mere survival to the human need to make meaning, and the inadequacy of a kind of chesed, the granting of compassion in the moment, as she says, to the human desire. In this mode of chesed, in a world where God is silent, the status quo is apparently preserved, but nothing is illuminated by the chesed, God's role, right? And so she goes on to say the following: the real problem is human recognition of chesed as chesed, loving kindness. Implicit in the servant's prayers is the need to see a manifest indication of God's chesed to Abraham. His main criterion for the rightness of Rebekah's election is that he will sense in her the chesed that since the Akedah has been lacking from his master's experience. He prays to know, by means of her rightness, that chesed is being done to his master. Not merely that God should be so kind as to make it happen that the girl he speaks to is the right one. The chesed he asks for, in other words, is not a means, but an end in itself, right? What she's saying here is that Eliezer seems to intuit that there is a need here for a manifestation of God's loving kindness, not only in I will be successful in my task and the right woman will be found and Isaac will find a wife, but that right woman be substantively the human embodiment of Chesed, right? You see the move she's making. Just as it wasn't enough that God's Chesed manifest in the saving of Isaac at the last minute, but that we need to see God's Chesed embodied in human acts of loving kindness. It has to come from us in order to be the thing that will potentially restore some sense of meaning. Now, I want to note here also how striking it is that it is Eliezer the servant who gets this. Right? There are many, many commentators who ask the question about the length and repetition of the section that we just read. The Torah is usually very spare in relating stories, and an awful lot of real estate is devoted to Eliezer's thinking process, what actually happens, and then his relating what actually happened to Rebecca's family, right? That's a lot of repetition. The Torah could have just said, and he told them what had happened, right? And usually the commentators say this just goes to show that how precious is even the conversation of the servants of the patriarchs, right? Because like how much more the conversation of the patriarchs. I want to suggest here that something else really is going on, and that is that Eliezer really is quite a significant figure here. That he sees, because he is proximate, but just distant enough, he understands what is needed. He understands the theological crisis. He's quite a sophisticated, elevated soul. And he's working an intervention here beyond what Abraham asks him to do. He himself is the model of Chesed that he is looking for in the figure of Rebecca. He is extending extra kindness and not just fulfilling what he is obligated to do, but going beyond and functioning as a kind of healer for this family. Right. And I raised earlier the notion that, he may be understanding that Chesed is more important than DNA. Right. That's a really important point here. He is theoretically a member of this household, but not what we would call a Jew, not a member of the covenant in that sense, although the whole household was circumcised, right? Like he's not of Abraham's DNA. But he's living side by side with him in a partnership of loving kindness and support. That matters. Right? Eliezer understands that probably matters more than the DNA of the wife here. But we, the reader, are supposed to understand that it actually matters also in terms of the healing that needs to come to this family and the ability to move forward, right? He understands what neither Abraham nor Isaac can identify, that Chesed is what is needed, right? And this is something always that we can and should be doing for each other. But it's one of the most important tasks that we have in life, is to be the person who sees this is a family in sorrow and crisis. This is an individual in sorrow and crisis and pain. This person needs kindness. Okay. Into the mix comes Rebecca. As I mentioned, the two leitwords, camels and chesed, gemalim and loving kindness, chesed. Rivka, of course, is the embodiment of the chesed that Eliezer understands needs to be found here, evidenced by the alacrity and strength with which she responds to the stranger. No questions, no distrust, no pushback, nothing. This stranger appears and asks for a drink, and she says, of course. And not only that, I'm going to water all your camels. That's an enormous amount of work. I mean, this is like supernatural strength that the text is imagining here on the part of Rebecca. That's not just, I'm going to take 2 minutes out of my day and, give $1 to the stranger or the street. This is, I'm going to invest an enormous amount of time and effort to water this whole herd of camels, right? Camels are probably anachronistic to the region at this time. But what do we know about camels? They consume more water than any other animal, probably, right? Like camels are like water hogs, right? So look at what she does here. And this is Soloveitchik. I want to share with you just a little bit of Soloveitchik's insight here. He points out that there's another piece of her chesed here, and he brings the 13 attributes of God, which are recited to Moses in Exodus 34. And in the 13 attributes of God, which Moses hears, there is a phrase, Erech Apayim v'Rav Chesed v'Emet. Erech Apayim is patience and being slow to irritation and anger. And then Rav Chesed and Emet, the great in Chesed and truth. And there's a debate about whether Moses bowed low in response to hearing the Chesed or in response to hearing the Erech Apayim. And he says that here she demonstrated both. And that Arichut Apayim, right, the patience and forbearing reflects the irrational side of Chesed, the ability to respond with kindness, even in the face of improper behavior from the potential recipient of that kindness. And he says, if someone approaches me and asks for a favor, I don't mind complying. This is a natural response of Chesed. But if that person is arrogant and insolent in his approach, that calls for Arichut Apayim. Eliezer, Abraham's servant, wished to determine whether Rebecca possessed not only the attribute of Chesed, but also of this forbearing patience. And therefore, he approached her in a tactless manner, literally asking to be spoon-fed. He did not approach her in a gentlemanly fashion. Note that he doesn't even introduce himself, right? When he saw her Arichut Apayim, her great patience and eagerness to practice Chesed, he realized immediately that she was fit to be a partner in the Abrahamic community. That's amazing, right? It reminds me of the story, the famous story about Hillel and Shammai, where, the person comes to Hillel and says, teaches me the Torah, comes to Shammai, teach me the Torah on one foot, right? And then Shammai says, get out of here. And Hillel, of course, teaches him Torah. That story is in the context of a man who really, really tries his best to irritate Hillel, right? Who keeps coming to him like 5 minutes before Shabbat when he's in the shower washing his hair and yelling, Hillel, Hillel, and making him come outside. And he does it 3 times, right? And Hillel demonstrates this enormous patience. That's what Soloveitchik is anticipating here. Okay, so we find this person, and I think what the text is suggesting, related to what I said before about the crisis, is that in this repetition of camels and camels and camels and camels, and the word chesed, the world is experiencing a gap between the gap in the middle of the phrase Gemilut Chasidim. Chesed is the abstract concept of loving kindness. right? It's the concept, it's the feeling of compassion. Gemilut Chasidim are deeds of loving kindness. And so instead of having Gemilut Chasidim, we have Gemalim, the same root, and Chesed, and they're separate, right? And what needs to happen is that Chesed, the concept, the abstract kindness, needs to be embodied in action in a way that this family that has been so traumatized can experience it. We didn't read this part, but when Rivka and Isaac actually meet, there's a parallel in the text where Rivka lifts up her eyes and she sees Et Yitzchak. Isaac lifts his eyes and he sees camels, right? Like he can't see in his world the expression of loving kindness in a human being. He's been so wounded. He's inherited the trauma of his parents, and he himself has experienced it. And so he cannot see the integration. All he can see is camels. Rivka both symbolizes and enacts the loving kindness. And that makes all the difference in the world. It makes all the difference in the world. How so? Here's what Aviva Zornberg says is the central response that needs to happen here. So Rashi notes that at the end of the parsha, when they meet, Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he took Rebekah as his wife. Isaac loved her and thus found comfort after his mother's death. The classical midrash, which Rashi brings, notes, it is human nature that as long as a person's mother is still alive, kayemet, one is involved, entangled with her. And when she dies, he comforts himself in his wife. Aviva Zornberg notes that Rashi is pointing a spotlight here on the issue of Isaac's entanglement with his mother's life, her very essence, the problem of her existence. Right? Remember, we said that Sarah dies, according to the Midrash, as a result of the shock, of the almost notness, of the existential crisis. He, Isaac, is caught up in the vertigo of her being. For Isaac to be comforted is to free himself of this fascination with his mother's pain and to turn to his own life. Rashi often explains the word nachama, comfort or regret, as machshava acheret, a different thought. The notion is that comfort and regret both imply a shift in paradigms, allowing new questions, new anomalies, to remove one from old preoccupations. In his reading, therefore, Isaac is freed from his preoccupation with his mother's life. He is freed essentially for new thoughts, a new way of thinking his existence. How does Hesed do that? What's the function here? Okay, so I want to share with you a reading of the Netivot Shalom, the great Hasidic master of the late 20th century. And he brings a verse from the Psalms, which is now well known because of a melody for it by Menachem Creditor. The verse is, Ki amarti olam chesed yibaneh. And the JPS translation, which is probably the plain meaning of it, is, I declare your steadfast love is confirmed forever. The plain meaning is that it is likely the psalmist speaking, and the olam refers to time and eternity, right? So the psalmist says, it's like Kileam Chasto, right? Your kindness, God, is forever. But midrashically, it is often read, and the Netivot Shalom reads it this way, as God revealing that the world is built and rebuilt through Chesed. As though God is saying, for I said, the world is built through loving kindness. Right? And the Netivot Shalom quotes this, and he goes on to say, meaning, the world stands entirely on the attribute of Chesed. And therefore, the beginning of the Olam HaTikun, the world of spiritual fixing and healing, right? The depth healing in the structure of existence and the universe began with Abraham, our father, because he embodies and is associated with the attribute of kindness. This is the meaning of, I said a word is built through kindness. And this is the theme of all these Torah portions involving Avraham Avinu. They come to teach how through Chesed, Abraham began to build the Olam HaTikun, a kind of simultaneous parallel universe of repair and healing of everything that is broken and all of the pain and divisiveness in the world. And the special unique feature of Chesed compared to all of the other attributes is that it has to be every day, all day. And he quotes another Hasidic Rebbe, the Rebbe of Kobrin, saying, every day a Jew has to do some act of Chesed. And a person should not let even one day go by without doing some act of Chesed. Furthermore, a day in which a person doesn't do any Chesed isn't really considered a day of their life. Right? This is a commentary on the opening of the Parsha and the years of Sarah and the days of Sarah, and they were all equal in goodness, right? Every single one of them had Chesed, right? Like, what was that old commercial? Like, a day without oranges is orange juice, a day without sunshine. Remember that? It's like a day without Chesed is a day that is lacking in some essential vitality, right? A day in which one has not been kind. It's not a full thing. And similarly, he quotes another source that divine abundance from above, the flow of divine chesed, is awakened by chesed performed below. And so he says, through this, when a Jew engages in chesed, it draws chesed from heaven. And therefore, every day of life, we have to do some act of chesed. Doesn't matter what, to one's fellow, whether it's physically or financially or spiritually, whatever one does. And he gives an example: learn something with someone, give chizuk, give encouragement and strength to someone with your words. And through this, you make chesed rain down upon your fellow person from heaven. Right? Now, how this works is both mystical and practical. It's functioning on both levels. He's talking about the mystical level, right? On the mystical level, you increase the flow of heavenly chesed when you engage in chesed below. What we do has cosmic implications in that sense, right? And this is what Eliezer intuits. We need someone who can bring back a sense of chesed, of God's chesed, to this family who has experienced terror and has lost any sense of meaning. And also, it needs to be embodied because the only way that they are going to realize that God's chesed is back is through human action. That is the only path forward. Right? And so the practical piece of this, which is so essential, to go back to Aviva Zornberg's point about the idea of comfort being the thinking of a new thought. when, as she notes, here, let me just find it. The notion is that comfort and regret both imply a shift in paradigms, allowing new questions, new anomalies to remove one from old preoccupations. So I want to share that one of the things I've really been sitting with in this last month is that this is a moment when all of the paradigms and the narratives and the theories that we hold that have managed to get us through the day, the way that we make meaning, the way that we think about what to do in the world, have been revealed to be the inadequate, incomplete, broken maps that they have always been. And we feel lost. That is not because there was something particularly wrong with those paradigms and those theories and those narratives and those maps that we made. It's because any humanly created narrative and paradigm and theory and map is inevitably incomplete. Eventually, we see where they are wrong. And I want to say that this is something we are experiencing wherever we have been on the political spectrum with regard to Israel. It's happening on the right, it is happening on the left. The hawkish narratives have been proven to be incomplete and inadequate. The dovish narratives have been proven to be incomplete and inadequate. And there are two possible responses when that happens. One is that we double down on what we thought, and we refuse to see the ways in which the way we've made sense of the world has been inadequate because it is too scary. And then we will likely devolve into a spiral of recriminations and I told you so's. You see, I was right and you were wrong. And we become furious at the people who we think it's their fault because they didn't listen to us. The alternative is to think a different thought. That's the definition of comfort, regret, and thinking a different thought. The alternative is to say, I guess I need to think about things anew. I guess I was wrong about some things and I need to think some new thoughts. That is where comfort is intertwined with hope. Because that is where, when the people who have the courage to start thinking different thoughts at all points of the spectrum get together and talk, then all kinds of new possibilities open. What enables someone to be that kind of person? What enables someone to choose the path of self-reflection and thinking a different thought? It is the comfort and safety of Hesed. Right? It is when we are seen for our sorrow and our pain and our fear, and that sorrow and pain and fear is met with loving kindness, then we can have the courage to say, maybe there is a way forward. Note in Aviva Zornberg's framing of this moment that what happens for Isaac is that he becomes a little bit disentangled from his mother's trauma, and he is able to meet the moment he is in as a new moment now in his own life. And he is better able to manage the trauma for him when he disentangles it from his mother's. Right? So I want to close by sharing with you two quotes that were that came to my attention from a teaching of Daniel Smokler. who's a colleague from the Wexner Foundation. And he raises this question of chesed building the world. And is it possible? And can we live in this kind of chesed? Can we be Rebecca? Can we be the kind of Rebecca? He doesn't raise this, but I'm connecting with Soloveitchik's understanding of not just chesed, but arichut apayim, chesed even with people who are difficult, right? I'm not talking about Hamas now. I'm talking about the people who push our buttons, who are likely to fight with, who are provocative. So here are the two quotes. The first is from Anderson Cooper's interview with Chayei Lifshitz on October 28th on CNN, whose parents are among the kidnapped hostages. And Lifshitz says, "There is no one, we are devastated. How do we come out of this trauma? I don't know. How do we make something that is worth living for?" Cooper says, "Do you have that answer?" And Chayei Lifshitz says, "I just think, be kind. I really do believe that we should all participate in the little acts of kindness. That makes a difference." Cooper, even now. Lifshitz, what is the alternative? What is the alternative? You know, the bloodshed now, I don't enjoy any death, not for anyone. It just makes me so sad that in our world, we are creating so many stories of trauma and destruction. That's the first quote. The second is from an article by Dara Horn in the Times on October 22nd. What defines Jewish life is not history's litany of horror, but the Jewish people's creative resilience in the face of it. In the wake of many catastrophes over millenniums, we have wrestled with God and one another, reinvented our traditions, revived our language, rebuilt our communities, and found new meanings in our old stories of freedom and responsibility, each story animated by the improbable and unwavering belief that people can change. This, I think, these two quotes capture in a nutshell the way that Rebecca's chesed functions. First Eliezer's chesed, and then Rebecca's chesed functions as an intervention in the trauma, the tragic residue of the lives of Abraham and Sarah, and enable Isaac to move on and process his own trauma in a different way. And that is what enables continuity. Olam Chesed Yibaneh.